Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the NUS Museum's anniversary lecture by T.K. Sabapathy. Before the lecture begins, please take a moment to switch your mobile phones to silent. Please also refrain from flash photography during this event. We hope you enjoy the lecture. Let us now welcome Mr. Ahmad Mashadi, head of the NUS Museum, who will be our MC for this evening.
A very good evening to everyone. We wish to welcome Mr. Joseph Mullenix, Deputy President, Administration for the University. We also wish to welcome Ms. Sharon Tan, newly appointed Director at the Center for the Arts. We are here today for an exciting lecture, and we are honored to have Mr. T.K. Sabapathy deliver it. This lecture is organized to mark the 60th year of the founding of the University of Malaya Art Museum. That was on 7 April 1955, the predecessor institute of the NUS Museum today. The University of Malaya is a significant part of the university's history, which incidentally this year it's celebrating its 110 years. And yet another anniversary, the larger, more important perhaps, is the Singapore's 50th year of national independence. These are two events that in some ways provide an anchoring context to tonight's proceedings. That is, what an account of Sullivan may say about the university and its history, and what the same account may say about Singapore's heritage. Before we invite Mr. T.K. Sabapathy on stage, we will have an introduction to be provided by Mr. Kwa Chong Guan, a man of many hats. He is often described as a person who works on the intersections of history, security studies, and international relations of Southeast Asia, working in multiple capacities. Currently, he is Senior Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU, and also Honorary Adjunct Associate Professor and Visiting Fellow at the Archaeological Unit of the Nalanda Srivijaya Center at ISIS. I can list more of his appointments, but let me direct us today to his role during the late 1980s and early 1990s as the director of then National Museum, where he was tasked to oversee its transformation into the National Heritage Board and a series of newer state museums. A task that I believe he undertook with in a broad consultative manner, and crucially involved university experts like John Mixick, who's here, and of course, Sabapathy. May I invite Mr. Kwa Chong Guan, who is also the member of the museum's academic committee, to introduce our speaker. Mr. Kwa.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I thank Ahmad for that introduction, which I do not deserve, since I'm not the speaker for this evening. Rather, it is Kanaga who I have been asked to introduce. When Ahmad phoned me a few weeks ago, can you say a few words at this lecture? I said, sure. And then as it turned out over tea, can you also say a few words about this? And then about that. So it turns out I've been given a mission impossible of not only introducing Kanaga, but also to frame him within the context of this museum, which he has been intimately associated with. I've been given 10 minutes, and so before the trap door below me opens up, I like to time myself. I would like to start by asking Kanaga if he remembers my writing to him in 1966, inviting him to contribute an article to the old University of Singapore History Society journal, which I was then, for that year, the editor of. I was in 1966, following Kanaga's footsteps in signing up for the course in art history taught at the University Museum by William Willets. He had been recruited in 1963 to succeed Michael Sullivan, whose contributions to the Art History and Development Museum we are gathered here to commemorate. As editor of the History Society Journal and student of art history, I thought it salient to highlight the discipline of art history, which was, and I think Kanaga will agree with me wholeheartedly, is still too little known. So I'm delighted that Kanaga, who had then in 1966 moved from Berkeley to continue his studies in art history at the School of Oriental and African Studies, responded with alacrity to my invitation and sent me an article. What is it now? Some observations on the stag and elk motif in Scythian animal style. I have to belatedly apologize to Kanaga that for reasons I cannot remember now, I could not include the illustrations he sent. So the reprint of Kanaga, you notice, has got none of the illustrations you sent me. Thereafter, our lifelines parted. I went on to a career in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and then Defense, before being assigned to lead the old National Museum through a strategic planning process and reorganization in the mid-1980s onwards. Kanaga's hopes of returning to Singapore to teach art history after finishing his graduate studies at the SOAS were, however, dashed by the then Vice Chancellor, Dr. Toh Chin Chai, who was visiting London in July 1970, and Kanaga vividly remembers asking Dr. Toh about job prospects, and Dr. Toh telling him that he intended to close down the museum because it was, as Kanaga remembers vividly, a beachcombers heaven. So, stunned and shocked, I think Kanaga spent the rest of that evening drinking beer at somewhere in London. And he went on to apply for a job at the new University of Science, Malaysia, where they were advertising for a teaching post in art history. At Penang, Kanaga then turned his attention from the grand traditions of classical Asian art he had been absorbing at Berkeley and London to the teaching of history and writing of contemporary Malaysian art. Kanaga collaborated with Reza Piadasa to establish the foundations and field and the framework for studying the history and writing about contemporary Malaysian and Singapore art. Together, Kanaga and Piadasa identified the pictorial techniques and affiliations of what has been known, come down to be known as the Nanyang style, which has today become the master narrative about Singapore and Malaysian art. Kanaga, I think, had a very good 10 years at Penang before his contract ran out, and he had to return to Singapore in 1980, where he secured a lecturership in art history at the School of Architecture at this university here. He then continued to develop the historical methods, critical documentation, and techniques for the explication of the works of leading artists who have defined Singapore and Malaysian art. Kanagas' career and mine crossed again in the late 1980s when I was assigned to take over the old National Museum and lead it through a major reorganization. Kanaga had then established a formidable reputation as an art critic, writer, through his columns in the Straits Times. I was told that any budding artist in Singapore and Malaysia had to receive the imprimatur of Kanaga and Piadasa in a newspaper review of their works, or better, get Kanaga to curate an exhibition of their works, and even better, write a catalog about it if they were to progress anywhere in their career as an artist. Otherwise, they hadn't made it. So Kanaga may remember my turning to him to help curate our first traveling exhibition to Washington, D.C., entitled Many in One, and to write the catalog for that show. I also came to value Kanaga's advice and trust his judgment as a member of the acquisition committee that I got the curators to form to validate their proposed acquisitions of Singapore art. Up to the point of time, the curators just bought and the director then approved the sales, purchase, and I said, no, that's not something I'm going to do. Please go and form a committee and tell me that you had got the agreement. So together with Lu, Kanaga had a defining role in shaping the collection strategies and collections of our art museum throughout the 1990s. In 1992, Kanagas Career took him back to the old University of Singapore museum collection. Dr. Toh Chin Chai did actually carry out his threat to close down the museum in 1993, his reasons being the isolation of the museum, its lack of visitors, and disinterest in art history. Kanaga and I would dispute that, of course, but be that as it may, the university's collections were then transferred to the old National Museum, where parts of it were displayed, and it was one of my assignments when I was sent there in the late 80s to pack up this collection and return it to the university, because at that point of time, the university had merged with the old Nanta, and as part of the merger had inherited the collections of the old Nanyang University, and they were obligated to display it there. So I think the university wanted to augment that largely Chinese collection that they had inherited and took it back. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, the then curator Lu Yo, very scholarly gentleman, some of you may remember him, was largely interested in Chinese art. And so that Lee Kong Chian Museum, as it was displayed in some rooms in the old business wing, business management administration wing of the university, was a display of Chinese art, which you see downstairs in the museum, the Lee Kong Chian display. So Kanaga in 1992, I think, was given some money together with a group of students. I think Lai Chi Kian, who was among you there, was among them, to every weekend open those boxes I had packed up from the National Museum and check that the National Museum had not kept anything and had returned everything that they were entrusted to. Then in 1997, the museum moved to new space below the university library, which brought together the old Nanta collection, the Lee Kong Chian collection, with the newly acquired collection of Ng Teng, and also parts of the old University of Singapore Museum. But I think it was finally in 2002 when the University Museum got a new lease of life, when it moved into dedicated space in this building here, right there. And I think Kanagas' career has, I think, come full circle when he was invited to lead the curatorial team to install the inaugural exhibition in this new museum. So tonight, we are delighted to hear Kanaga reflecting on the beginnings of this museum. Hopefully, Kanaga will also move on to reflect on the closure of the museum and his revival of it at some time in the future. Kanaga.
Thank you, Mr. Kwa. And thank you for reminding us about the circuitous movement of collections and those that work with them, particularly the episode of involving the return of the collection back to the university from the National Museum in the 1980s, and as such, pointing to the lesser-known transfer that took place in 73. This is part of the backgrounding context to tonight's lecture, that is, the university's collection, initially developed by Michael Sullivan in the 50s, relocated temporarily at the National Museum in the 70s and 80s, so as to form part of a story of nation. But this is perhaps another story for another evening. Tonight, we revisit one of the perhaps pivotal moments in modern museology and art teaching in Singapore. Delivering these talks, of course, the university's own T.K. Sabapathy. Mr. Kwa had provided an introduction to Sabapathy. If I may, let me add a few more lines. Mr. Sabapathy is well known to many of us here. He sits among his peers of art historians in Southeast Asia and Asia, such as Jim Sepangkat, Apinan Posyananda, John Clark, and all, whose writings interact and very much often reference one another. He had done more than others in Singapore to promote perhaps a modern art history based on lines of tradition, their encounters, context of art making, and their outcomes. He is also, importantly, many things to many people. For students of the university, for the 4 generations of architects, we have Lai Chi Kian here, Mok Wewe somewhere here, and Imran Tajuddin. He is known for his stirring teachings into the grand traditions of Asia and Southeast Asia, and what these may mean into forms of research and cultural production today. For generations of artists, particularly those that emerged in the 1980s and after, we have Saleh here, Chandra, Kumari. He is an art critic, fearsome at times, and importantly, a critic patron that sought to support newer practices. Sabapathy's presence and support, for example, of the activities of the Artist Village in its early years is well known. Leewen can testify to that. For the generations of curators across institutions in Singapore and even Malaysia, he was a go-to person, even today, especially today perhaps, as the staff of the National Art Gallery, who I hear me say. His exhibition, for example, on Lim Cheng Ho as early as 1986 at then National Museum Art Gallery was one of the first in its kind to systematically assemble, organize, and interpret artworks, providing a basis in exhibition making vigorously based on research and study. Many others followed, including his work with the Ng Eng Teng collection at the university, as well as the important 2002 exhibition reopening the University Museum. Academic, art historian, writer, critic, curator, and to some of us, a generous friend. I'm pleased to invite Mr. T.K. Sabapathy.
Wow. Thank you, Chongguan. Thank you, Ahmad. I've never heard my name pronounced so often in 10 minutes. It's quite overwhelming. I'm extremely happy to be here amongst many of you whom I've known for quite some time in various capacities. And my guru, Professor Wang Gangwu, whom I remember vividly when I first entered the university, and to have him here to listen to me is something else. But most importantly, for the subject of this evening, Michael Sullivan. I put together some thoughts which have to do with my recollections of being a student in the University of Malaya from 1957 to 1962, when it was then in the Bukit Timah campus. My thoughts of entering studies with Michael Sullivan and then departing and then coming back. I have also put together thoughts on what I could muster. I'm not a biographer. I'm not savvy enough to be a biographer. But to talk a little bit about Sullivan, the man. And then go on to generalize on certain aspects of the discipline of history of art. For a brief moment in these deliberations, we have a recording of Sullivan talking with, I think, Sean J. In 2006. I will be inserting that just to hear him at that time. July 1958. In the latter half of that year, the class of 1957 in the Faculty of Arts filtered into the Oei Tiong Ham Hall, University of Malaya, Bukit Timah, to register for subjects in the new academic year. This photograph is very close to the campus when we entered in 1957, very close. Quite at least for us, a grand driveway led us into this circle and into this building, which was the main assembly hall, which is the Oei Tiong Ham Hall, which then led to two quadrangles, as we call them, the lower quadrangle, the upper quadrangle, which is where our life as students spun around. And this was the beginnings of the library. And on this side, eventually there emerged the residencies for students. Raffles Hall was here, and further down was Yusuf College. All that was consolidated in 1957. We had completed the freshman year in Kuala Lumpur, returning to Singapore to continue undergraduate studies. Why were we in Kuala Lumpur? A brief explanation. In 1957, the year in which we began our studies, Malaya gained independence and recognition as a sovereign nation. To mark that momentous transformation and realization, and it was momentous for many, it was decided to inaugurate a university in the newly constituted nation and in its capital, Kuala Lumpur. This move, which initially led to dividing the university into two somewhat connected components, and subsequently to establishing two separate institutions, was preceded by protracted discussion and met in certain sectors adversely and acrimoniously. Be that as it may, as an undergraduate at that time, I do not recall receiving explanations for shunting students from only the Faculty of Arts to Kuala Lumpur to set up a university, in which circumstances we were housed in and shared facility with students in the Technical College in Gurney Drive, just outside the city. I can only presume, retrospectively, that it was inexpensive and expedient to do so. All you needed to do was move bodies and books, and not laboratories, workshops, technicians, and massive apparatus. Construction of a new university campus began in Pantai Valley on the outskirts of the city of Kuala Lumpur, as it was then. The first intake of students in 1958 was for the study of engineering. The year-long sojourn in Kuala Lumpur between 1957 and 58 left deep impressions in me, some of which I have recounted and published earlier. I returned to July 1958 in Oei Tiong Ham Hall on Bukit Timah. That's the building presently, but it still maintains its earlier construction with that porch and a flight of stairs leading up to it. On entry into the second year, we were required to register for 2 subjects, categorized as principal subjects, and for 1 as subsidiary. Principal and subsidiary correspond to major and electives today. Students pursued studies of subjects in both categories for 2 academic years, continuously, at the end of which one qualified for or was offered a placement in pursuing an honors degree in the 4th year in one of the principal subjects. An academic year consisted of 3 consecutive terms, each for 10 weeks. For the duration of 10 weeks, I enrolled in English literature and history as principal subjects, completing undergraduate studies with an honors degree in history. Why am I relating all of these, and how might they have to do with talking about Michael Sullivan? Do bear with this slow build-up, because it has a purpose in what I will unfold subsequently. Oh yeah, I failed to mention the subsidiary subject I signed for. It marks the entry into a sphere in which Sullivan was prominent, and for talking a little about him. Among subjects offered at the subsidiary level was the history of art. On a table in Oei Tiong Ham Hall on that July registration day was a sheet of paper propped against a folded card bearing in bold history of art. Below it, on a second register, was a kind of disclaimer, at least I recall it as a disclaimer, which said something like, "No need to demonstrate abilities to draw or paint." Below that disclaimer was a kind of inducement, which I recall vividly, and it said, "Interest in language and advantage." Towards the bottom of the sheet was an invitation to sign on, and near its very bottom edge was printed, "Instructor Michael Sullivan." We hand-wrote our entry points at that time. At this table was seated, no, not Michael Sullivan, Eunice Theo, a lecturer in history, who 2 years later supervised in the writing of my honors dissertation, a generous, warm, and attentive teacher. While seated at that table on that July afternoon, she smiled at us and said, "It would be a fun cause." The impact of that disclaimer vis-à-vis no need to demonstrate abilities to draw or paint was not apparent until much later in my professional life, although it was at the time a relief to me and others as well, because visual or pictorial representation as a subject worthy of study was virtually unknown in our schooling. The effect of the inducement, on the other hand, i.e., interest in language as being an advantage, was immediate and enduring. About 16 students signed up for this subsidiary. This is a photograph taken in the upper quadrangle. This is the band of angels, as Sullivan called us. We loved that. Lectures were scheduled twice weekly, each for an hour. Tutorials were held fortnightly. Now we hear Sullivan.
And these students, at that time, in the 50s, Singapore was still a very young country. And the focus was very much on building infrastructure and making the nation work, essentially. why did students come to study art history rather than going into engineering or law or medicine or the areas that would have been more valuable, supposedly?
Well, of course, most of them did study valuable subjects. But I don't know, we had a few, like Kanaga.
He was one of your students?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, he was. And he'll tell you all about it. If you want to talk to him, he'll give you, he has vivid memories of it. I think they found it something new, and it maybe opened doors for them that they didn't know were there.
Interesting. Because, but what was the attitude, do you think, generally towards an art education at that time?
Oh, toward art education?
Yes, in Singapore.
Well, art education, do you mean by that teaching people to draw and paint?
Well, both.
Well, I think that was done in the schools, of course. But anything beyond that, as far as I know, didn't exist. There was no art history. I decided that as this is a sort of a culture with a dual inheritance, that they should learn a bit about Asian art and a bit about Western art. So the first year's course was in the art of India, China, and a little bit of Japan and Southeast Asia. And the second year's course was the art of the Mediterranean world, of Europe, essentially, up to Picasso. I don't know if we talked about American art, I don't remember.
Yes, that voice. I will be elaborating on this. As he said, the first year of his art history course was devoted to the study of traditions of Asian art, primarily from India and China, partially from Japan, and fleetingly from Southeast Asia. We traversed immense swaths of geography and history effortlessly, week after week, from the Indus Valley to the domains of the Cholas in India, and then moving from the Huanghe to the courts of the southern Sung, onto the imposition of the non-Han rulers of the Yuan, and then into the era of great brightness that followed with the Ming. The Qing dynasty was barely mentioned. In dealing with India, the focus was on sculpture, wherein the world was rendered palpable by carving and modeling. In China, the focus was on painting, especially landscape painting, whereby aspirations for being one with and in nature were seen as conveyed by brush and ink. Southeast Asia was illustrated fleetingly. 4 lectures were devoted to this region as a subject. We gained initial glimpses into arduous pathways for circumambulating and ascending Borobudur, into designs of imperial cosmologies by and for rulers in Angkor, and somewhat quickly into ceramic vessels produced in Indonesia, Vietnam, and export ware that was circulating in the region. In the second year, history of art lectures spanned equally extensive geographies and histories, this time from pharaonic Egypt to the Paris of Picasso, gliding over the Nile and Athens, somewhat tiptoeing through the vaulted cathedrals of Gothic Europe, bursting into Medicean Florence, and stopping at Picasso in Paris, precisely at Demoiselle d'Avignon, at the cusp of the 20th century in Europe. All of this sounds improbably impressive, and it was for all of us in the years 1958 to 60. Yet, a lecture was all for 50 minutes. Its delivery was introductory. Artworks were selectively shown and highlighted what we recognized later as masterworks. Even so, we were impressed deeply and consistently. We did not miss a single lesson. There were 2 reasons explaining our abiding interest. Firstly, a course such as this was completely novel. There was nothing like it in our entire schooling, not at the primary, not at the secondary, and not at the pre-university levels. Pictures never featured in our studies. It was unthinkable that human beings represented the world visually, pictorially, and did so with purpose and thoughtfully. It was even more unthinkable that such representations may be studied seriously and deeply, and that studies of such representations may yield knowledge and may spur ways of knowing. No, our scope of learning was not marked by any of these possibilities. We enrolled in the history of art in 1958 because of curiosity and because of its strangeness. Of course, the world of visual images, the world constituted by visual images, was not illuminated in and of itself. Neither did it appear as intelligible all at once through self-disclosure. We had a teacher who shaped and gradually illuminated such a world, Michael Sullivan. And I deal with the second reason as an explanation. Twice weekly, he walked into a lecture hall in the Manasseh Mayor building, carrying a box of slides. Yes, the slides were mounted on cardboard and glass in one hand, and a thin file consisting of loose sheets of paper, presumably notes to himself, tucked under an arm. I say presumably because besides flipping through these sheets at the beginning, I do not recall him consulting them during a lecture. By the way, there were no handouts with schedules of lectures and their topics. There were no handouts with summaries of contents of what is said in any one session. There were no handouts with annotations of readings and guidelines for study. There was no nothing. Readings and tutorial topics were posted on a notice board in the study in the Art Museum. If you did not read these notices, then you just did not know. Back to the lecture room. Sullivan handed the slides to an assistant who filed them into a